Chapter 1, The Beginning. I was first thinking that this story really began with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which changed many lives forever. From my standpoint, I had a happy, sheltered existence with no real problems and a secure and loving family, and suddenly a crisis. Then early in 1943, when I enlisted, my whole world changed. So this story did start then, but it was really in 1994 that two things happened that made me serious about trying to write this story. First, I had a conversation with my two older brothers, and we talked about the war for the first time. George, my older brother, had been skipper of an LST, landing ship tank, in the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and at Anzio. My other brother, Bill, had been a company commander in the Army Corps of Engineers in Sicily, southern France, and on into Germany. The second thing that triggered me was a reunion in Asheville, North Carolina, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the seaplane squadron that I flew with in 1944 and 45. As I thought about these two incidents, my mind went racing back to my lifelong fascination with flying, which started with a blimp ride over Washington, D.C., my hometown, in 1936. Few people in those days had ever flown. Commercial aviation was in its infancy and still somewhat of a novelty. I also remembered Sundays when my father would drive us to the airport that serviced Washington, D.C., where the Pentagon now stands. There I was fascinated by the Boeing 247, the Curtiss Condor, the DC-2, and then the DC-3 airliners. I read all the pulp magazines about World War I flyers. and their exploits. George A. Gray, one of this country's first aviators, lived a block from where I grew up. He had learned to fly from the Wright brothers themselves. His stories of flying one of their original planes and then subsequent models piqued my curiosity even further. He had performed flying scenes in many of the early movies, like The Perils of Pauline, so he had been famous as an aviator even before World War I was fought. Eventually, his oldest son married my sister, and Mr. Gray and I became good friends. So World War II became a vehicle to fly, and when I turned 17 and had graduated from high school, I enlisted in the Navy with my parents' grudging approval. In March 1943, I was off to Bainbridge, Maryland in boot camp. Then to Jacksonville, Florida, for aviation machinist mate school and radar operator and aerial gunnery schools. The world was changing. The Navy was the first time most of the people I was to meet, like me, had never been out of their parochial, localized environments they grew up in. They were from everywhere, big towns like New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, small towns like Milan, Tennessee, Paducah, Kentucky, Pampa, Texas, Yukon, West Virginia. They were from every economic strata and religion. A majority were single, but there were a number who were married and several who had started families. They were a varied group, Democrats and Republicans, Southerners who did not believe the Civil War was over, and a number from inner cities, which were not yet the run-down, crime-ridden, drug-infested areas of today, just poor. But most were from middle America, average citizens. Educationally, there were college graduates, college students, and teenagers just out of high school. The squadron then was a cross-section of the country in those days, except it was all white. Like the other armed forces of that time, the Navy was not an equal opportunity employer, and African Americans were destined only for menial jobs like mess stewards. To understand people who lived in those days, one must recognize there was a certain tenor that existed about life. Most people were from close-knit families, and there were certain values of living that existed in this country, most of which resulted from the fact, without seeming overly dramatic, they were all children of parents who had lived through the stock market crash and the Great Depression. We were not the self-centered, selfish society that seems to exist today. We didn't have guns except to hunt with. Drugs were largely unknown. We respected our elders. We respected the police and teachers. We belonged to the Boy Scouts. We played sports by ourselves without needing organizations like Little League Baseball or Pee Wee Football. From this we developed a certain self-reliance which I think stood us all in the good stead. There were a minority who questioned going to war, but most of the people I knew voluntarily joined up. There was a unanimity in the country like we had never had before, and maybe since. The seaplane. As noted earlier, the seaplane played a key, though not highly visible, role in this war. Those were days before all of the sophisticated surveillance and communication devices that the military has today. Radar was in its infancy, so it was mostly a visual war. Someone had to actually see the enemy before action took place, and this was a major role of the patrol plane. Patrol planes, some of which were seaplanes, were the eyes of the fleet. The PBY Catalina seaplane, which first became operational in the fleet in 1936, was the backbone of the Navy's patrol arm in the first 2 years of the war. PBY squadrons bore a large part of the brunt of naval aviation activity in the early days of the war and suffered terrible losses. Contrary to much thinking, they did in their own way help stem the tide in the Pacific, and by 1943 they were a major factor in the Pacific War, performing not only patrol bombing missions but untold rescues of downed flyers, functioning as Dumbo aircraft. Dumbo was the term given to the air-sea rescue planes. An unknown Army Air Force pilot summarized it all. When I see a PBY, I always stand up and salute it. Mel Crocker, in his fine book, Black Cats and Dumbos, noted in a statistical summary of World War II, the Navy's fleet air wings with their PBYs, PB2Ys, and PBMs acting as Dumbos rescued some 2,957 men and women, and in addition, evacuated some 1,069 people from various locations around the world. One reason for the apparent lack of recognition about seaplanes during World War II was eloquently expressed by James Mills in his book, Blue Catalinas of World War II. He wrote, "Perhaps the lonely nature of the work we did accounts for the lack of documentation. The mission of a single patrol craft, hundreds of miles from base, is less spectacular than waves of bombers attacking a munition factory. And indeed, most of the work performed in the Pacific by patrol craft was boring surveillance of miles of empty ocean." However, assurance that supposedly empty ocean was in fact empty was also vital information. I agree, and personally I feel that because we were obviously less glamorous than, say, the carrier-based aircraft, we got less press or credit for some of the spectacular things we did do. Also, there weren't many of us, and thus we were less well known. The PBM models we flew, the PBM 3D and the PBM 5, were small in numbers produced, only about 800, while a consolidated B-24 bomber, for example, that the Army Air Force flew, totaled some 24,000 produced. Our patrols or missions were almost always alone, long, and dangerous, lasting usually 10 to 12 hours, and at times 16 to 17 hours. Some crew members spent the hours monitoring radar and radio, fuel consumption, and engine performance. Other crew from their stations in the turrets provided constant surveillance of the ocean and skies for anything that may have escaped radar's electronic eye. Flying over the vast expanses of the ocean void of any landmarks demanded a high degree of piloting and navigational skill. Flying skills were tested to the ultimate, as often the plane had to be manhandled through tropical storm fronts that were in the patrol path. A storm encountered on the way out had to be dealt with on the way back, and these often violent wind shifts, drenching rains, and severe downdrafts were an ever-present danger even for a plane this sturdy. I think many of us, after we flew for a while in the Pacific, thought our worst enemy was the weather. As to the difficulty of navigation, a good example is cited when Crocker wrote that during the Battle of Midway, a lot of VP-23s, a PBY squadron, second pilots, flew as navigators in Army B-17 bombers because they simply couldn't find their way on patrols at sea. Although overshadowed by the PBY Catalina, which was operating in the Pacific long before Pearl Harbor, the PBM performed yeoman duty in the Pacific theater starting in January of '44, when the first squadron of PBM 3Ds, VP-202, was deployed. The PBM was ideally suited for forward area combat conditions and soon proved a stalwart replacement for the PBY, serving in all of the major campaigns in the Pacific Theater after January 44. The PBM was slow and cumbersome compared to many World War II planes, but as noted, war has a way of utilizing men and machines to their maximum, and the PBM responded well. PBM pilots and crews had to be sailors as well as aviators because handling the plane on the water required a set of seamanship skills in addition to flying the big boat. It was almost completely self-sustaining with a galley and sleeping accommodations, and the ability to stay at sea made it a complete war machine. Like the PBY, our plane could do whatever it was called upon to do, even when it meant redlining flight operating instructions. The PBM was a tough old bird, and we who flew in it held it in great respect, even though there were times when we might have cursed it. Like the PBY, the PBM almost always got you home, whatever the circumstances. Back to the beginning. Each time I thought about my conversation with my brothers and the meeting with many of my old shipmates, the more my mind wandered. Suddenly I was back to March 1944 and the U.S. Naval Auxiliary Air Station at Harvey Point, North Carolina. The air station was commissioned on June 13, 1943, for the primary purpose of training seaplane squadrons. There was some history attached to the location, formerly known as Harvey's Neck, which consisted of one of the great plantations of early colonial days and had been the home of one of the early provincial governors of North Carolina, John Thomas Harvey. Few of the officers and enlisted personnel standing on the ramp at Harvey Point, North Carolina, on the morning of March 2, 1944, knew each other. The 131 enlisted men who had been sent there under the command of Lieutenant Rex E. Rader were a mixed group. Some were PBM and PBY squadron veterans, including a number with considerable foreign duty. Others had recently completed operational training at other naval air stations like the ones at Jacksonville, Florida, Banana River, Florida, and Corpus Christi, Texas, and a number were recent technical school graduates. Officer personnel were a mix too. Many were veterans with previous overseas experience, primarily in PBYs and PBMs, with a goodly number of designated patrol plane commanders. Some came from instructors' jobs at various air stations, such as Banana River, Transitional Training Squadron, Atlantic, and the rest were from operational training units at various locations. The original breakdown of officer rank in the squadron was 1 lieutenant commander, 10 lieutenants, 18 lieutenants junior grade, and 29 ensigns. There was also a small administrative and ground support group of non-flying personnel. 5 were officers, 2 lieutenants and 3 ensigns, divided into the following departments of responsibility: maintenance, engineering, communication, ordnance, air combat information, and personnel. 8 were enlisted men, 2 chief aviation machinist mates, 1 chief aviation radioman, 1 chief aviation ordnanceman, 1 yeoman, 2 aviation ordnancemen, and 1 seaman. It was fortunate a number of the pilots were already qualified patrol plane commanders. Having such a large number of qualified PPCs was a bone of contention among some, as it meant having them to fly as first pilots with pilots who had no more experience than they. This did turn out, however, to be a real bonus later when we were overseas and the squadron expanded to 18 crews. The advanced area duty got more difficult with lots of night flying. So this group of young men would be the nucleus of Patrol Squadron 21, VP-21, which had been established at the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia on the previous day, March 1, 1944, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Joseph E. Dougherty, USN. We were all young guys, from 17 to some oldsters of 28 and 29, but the average age was about 19. There had been another VP-21 squadron with a long and illustrious history, beginning in the 1930s flying PBY-4s, Catalina flying boats. In September 1939, a section of VP-21 had deployed to the Philippines. In December 1940, that section was redesignated as part of VP-101 and became part of Patrol Wing 10. In April 1942, the rest of the squadron joined the original contingent now in Perth, Australia, and became part of VP-101. VP-101 fought valiantly in most of the early battles in the Pacific.